And this is what that's part of what makes America such a special place. But, to understand this challenge, to look at beyond our borders and to understand how this socialism works its way into these systems, I'm very privileged to be introducing, I'm going to do my best. José Mayoral was born in Caracas, Venezuela in 1961. He attended in Colegio San Ignacio. He received a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Lehigh University in 1984. Jose worked in a number of family businesses in Venezuela, in Spain, including their GM, Jeep, and Honda motorcycle dealerships. His primary focus was on managing the family's food distribution, sugar confectionery, and chocolate companies. He came to America in 1998, but went back to Venezuela frequently to help his family and friends, and together with his family was a witness to socialism's destruction of Venezuela's economy and his family's business that employed hundreds of people. His family's car dealership no longer sells cars and instead operates as a car repair shop. The food and candy companies are gone, victims of the Chavez price controls on food that favored imports over local production. In the year 2000, Jose started the Fiesta Candy Company in New Hampshire and later renamed it to Great Bay Chocolates. He lives in York, Maine, and is pleased, if you haven't tried them yet, to have brought with him for your enjoyment some samples of his company's chocolate. Oh, that was...
Thank you, comrade. Well, it is very sad that we have to be here talking about the dangers of an ideology that killed 100 million people not so long ago. Time is part of the problem. Some of us are old enough to remember the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, the gulags. But now, all that evidence of a failed system is gone, forgotten and ignored by educators and the media. All that remains are the images of Che Guevara's on t-shirts worn by entitled and ignorant people. There is, however, a current example of socialism that we can use to illustrate the dangers of this disease, a tragedy that is happening this century now as we speak, and I'm talking about Venezuela. My name is José Mayoral, and I am from Venezuela. I was born in Caracas, the capital, and a city I miss. Let me tell you a little bit about Venezuela. It's a beautiful country in the northern part of South America. It has Caribbean beaches, Andes Mountains, tropical jungles, large plains. It's about the size of New England plus the mid-Atlantic states. The population is about 30 million. It's largely indigenous, but immigrants have come from Spain, Portugal, Italy, slaves that escaped from the British colonies, Palestinians, Greek, Hungarians, Chinese. My own grandparents migrated from Puerto Rico in the 30s. Religion is mostly Catholic, as you would expect from a former Spanish colony, but there are thriving Jewish and Muslim communities. There are no identity politics in Venezuela. We've never had time for that. Everyone's a minority there, and everybody needs each other to survive. So, but what brings Venezuela to the world stage is petroleum. Venezuela has the largest proven reserves of oil in the world, over 300 billion barrels. That's larger than Saudi Arabia and larger than Iraq and Iran combined. Around 1914, oil production began in Venezuela. This was the year of the Great War. Enormous deposits of very light oil were found in Cabimas and Lake Maracaibo, and soon Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil developed massive fields, pipelines, and refineries. By 1940, Venezuela was the third largest producer and the largest exporter of oil in the world. With oil exports came oil revenues in the form of salaries to employees and royalties to the state that fueled a large government that employed hundreds of thousands and financed enormous public works like the roads, bridges, electrical, you name it. They were the finest in Latin America. Along with the public sector came a strong private economy in the services, construction, commerce, and food, light industry. Demand for labor fueled enormous immigration from all these countries I mentioned before. In 1950, Venezuela had a larger GDP per capita than Canada. In 1958, dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez was deposed and Venezuela became a republic. Well, sort of. There were two major parties, Social Democrats and Christian Democrats, and a minor party that just happened to be the Socialist Party. The two major parties agreed to share power in alternating elections. The Socialist parties were happy to get some representation in the Congress and a few mayors here and there. Let's not kid ourselves, it was a corrupt system. But there was a constitution, checks and balances, and a free press that uncovered scandals and kept graft to acceptable levels. In 1997, Venezuela still had the largest GDP per capita in Latin America, larger than Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, or Colombia. And life was good. My family ran a General Motors dealership that my grandfather started. He also started a pre-mixed cement company. My uncle had the Honda motorcycle distribution for the country. My father and uncle started a candy company and bought a chocolate company that happened to be the oldest business in the country. They also started a company that would distribute their goods and other foodstuffs to every single kiosk and bodega in Venezuela. And there was full employment, so much so that we actually had to go to Colombia to hire workers because there weren't enough. So up to the turn of the century, Venezuela had the strongest economy in Latin America, strong institutions, and no desire whatsoever for a socialist economy. As a matter of fact, the socialists never tallied more than low single digits in any election. We never worried about socialism. We used to say, don't worry, Venezuela is not Cuba. So you fast forward today, Venezuela has been ruled by Hugo Chavez and his successor Nicolás Maduro for 20 years in an increasingly socialist manner. And now I'm going to give you some figures, but be aware that accurate numbers are hard to come by because most of them rely on government figures and they're not reliable. What I'm trying to say is that the tragedy is underreported. Venezuela is now the poorest country in Latin America by far. No question about it. Unemployment is at 44%. Between 4 and 6 million people have been forced to leave Venezuela because of a lack of basic needs like food and medicine. Now, this would be like 50 million people had to leave the United States. First, the doctors and engineers moved out, then the tradespeople, clerks, factory workers, and anyone able to move. People have spent their last resources to reach the border with Colombia, who are God-given neighbors, have opened their arms to welcome them. Colombians are remarkable people. Food production as a percentage of consumption went from 75% in 2008 to 30% today. Now, an estimated 40% of people rely on government-supplied food boxes as their main source of subsistence. Now, according to a study by the 3 universities in Caracas, Venezuelans have lost an average of 19 pounds in the past 3 years because of the lack of available food. It's called the Maduro diet. Medicine production has declined 80% from their highs. There's no insulin, hypertension medicine, antibiotics, antidepressants, or even analgesics. Venezuela today is the country with the most murders in the world. More than Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, El Salvador, you name it. 84 murders for 100,000 people. Compare that to 5 in the United States. Oil production has fallen from 2.4 million barrels a day to 700,000 barrels a day because of the lack of maintenance and investment. This year, the economy is expected to contract by 24%. Inflation, I mean, this is, the Weimar Republic is a joke compared to this. Inflation is over 10 million%. So the currency is worthless, and that makes trade and industry impossible. Water shortages are now common, so people are forced to get it from creeks like the Guaira River, which are essentially open sewers. There's a spike in intestinal diseases like amoebiasis and other dysenteries, as well as parasites like bilharzia and tapeworm. A lack of mosquito control has made diseases like dengue, malaria, Chagas, and Zika make a comeback throughout the country. According to Venezuelan government statistics, in 2008, there were 800,000 registered business entities in Venezuela. In 2018, there's 240,000. So imagine. Now, these statistics are just numbers. They don't adequately portray the extent of the tragedy that's taking place in Venezuela. When you lose the business that your grandfather, your father, and you built, it becomes personal. When your friends, acquaintances, or even family commit suicide, get shot, or sink into deep depression, it becomes personal. When you see people gathering food from trash heaps, when your former employees call you asking for help, but you can't give it to them, it's personal. In our case, the government forced to close. The candy company, chocolate company, and distribution company closed when the government forced price controls on all our goods and forced ridiculous salary increases on all our workers. We just couldn't hold it. There's no construction, so nobody needs pre-mixed cement. The GM dealership is still there, but they have no cars to sell because the government expropriated the GM assembly plant. They're trying to stay afloat by selling, making some repairs, but they're losing money. So I have often asked myself, what factors drove a sophisticated, wealthy society to allow this to happen? I think I've come up with some answers, but before you call the Nobel Committee, I have to tell you that they're obvious, if you know anything about history. The alarming thing is that while coming up with these answers, I found disturbing parallels to what's happening in the United States today. Don't worry, you may say, the US is not Cuba or Venezuela. I've heard this phrase before. Socialism and communism are always trying to take over. It's in their manifesto. And don't let semantics fool you. They're the same thing. One leads to another. Socialism needs a charismatic leader to succeed. In the case of Venezuela, it was Hugo Chavez. Chavez, you may have heard of him, was an army lieutenant that led a coup against Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1992. 92 was a bad year for Venezuela because of the price of oil had gone down to $20 a barrel, and there was some economic hardship even though it proved to be temporary. The day of the coup, I remember planes flying overhead, firing rockets. There were tanks going around and soldiers, probably drunk, firing the rifles in the air. It was scary, but then my grandfather told me that it was the 5th uprising that he could remember and had me check to see if we have ice and beer for a few days. So I was happy then. So the coup failed, and Chavez managed to escape with his life to Ecuador. From there, he groomed his image on TV and print as a corruption fighter. So he said he was going to be a corruption fighter. People from all walks of life adored him. Business people liked him because they thought he was a military man and he would restore order. Workers liked him because he promised to end corruption, and he was charming. He had me fooled. So the next idiot president, a man named Rafael Caldera, pardoned him, and Chavez ran for president in '98 and won by a landslide. We're lucky here in the United States this election. I don't think all the Democratic candidates put together have the charisma of a garden slug. So perhaps this election... Perhaps this election, we don't have to worry, but beware. So socialism needs a crisis, real or manufactured, preferably economic, to entice people to try a different system than they have. I don't see an economic crisis in the next year, but beware. In Venezuela, the crisis was caused by low oil prices, and Chavez took advantage of that. Socialism needs a struggle, an enemy, a cause, as an excuse to justify power grabs and bypassing the Constitution. I have a suspicion that this struggle has something to do with climate. In Venezuela, the case was this struggle was Yankee imperialism, which was a hard sell because Venezuelans love U.S. Americans. They love their baseball, they love their TV shows, and there's no problem there. And socialism also will take control of large portions of the nation's economy because by controlling the payroll, they can control the votes. Chavez took over as many businesses as he could, including the petroleum company, all the utilities, and he expropriated half of the companies in the country. By controlling the payroll, he controlled the vote to the workers. In the U.S., you can see this happening in the Democratic Washington and with all the public sector unions. Democrats are buying votes with public money. And so it can be seen that the Democrats push to control healthcare, 17% of the economy. It's the same thing. They want to control the votes by employing them. In Venezuela, socialism will also try to infiltrate and dominate critical institutions like the electoral system and the judiciary. In Venezuela, Chavez broke the electoral system and placed their own people. The last two elections were won by socialists, have been suspect, since the only observers were from other socialist nations and Jimmy Carter. No, seriously. Likewise, Chavez purged the Supreme Court and placed his own. So when I hear calls for the abolition of the Electoral College and the packing of the Supreme Court, I know where it's coming from. And I could go on for a long time. Chavez tried to start race and class hatred, persecuted religion, confiscated all guns, took over the press by closing opposing outlets, all tactics used today by the left. I'm running out of time. So I would like to give you a small update on what has happened recently in Venezuela. The popularity of Maduro's Socialist Party is around 20%, according to Western polling outlets. In 2018, opposition parties gained control of the National Assembly, which is a single chamber Congress that we have over there. But in order to win his latest presidential election in 2018, Nicolás Maduro banned and jailed all his opposition leaders, notably Leopoldo López and María Corina Machado. Then the Venezuelan Constitution, which was approved during Chávez's mandate, states that if fair presidential elections are not held on a timely manner, the head of the National Assembly becomes president in charge, and he is tasked with organizing fair elections. The National Assembly determined that elections were fraudulent and designated Juan Guaidó as interim president. Since the National Assembly designation of Guaidó as president, over 50 nations have recognized him as legitimate president, including the US, UK, Japan, Argentina, Israel, Colombia, and Canada. I am very disappointed to say that the European Union has not yet recognized Guaidó. They have their own issues with socialism. The Trump administration has been very helpful to the Venezuelan people by providing recognition, embassies, and support to the interim government, as well as by placing sanctions on Venezuelan politicians. The Democratic Party has not been supportive of Guaidó, and the sanctions imposed by Trump. Several prominent Democrats, including Bernie Sanders, Ayanna Pressley, Ocasio-Cortez, Tulsi Gabbard, and Ilhan Omar, have publicly expressed their support for the Maduro government. Throughout the year, massive protests over the country have been brutally repressed by army and political police, with several hundred dead and over 1,400 political prisoners. Venezuelans throughout the world are hoping that one day soon the armed forces of Venezuela will stop repressing their own and return Venezuela to freedom and prosperity. On a positive note, just last week, the other socialist country in South America, and that would be Bolivia, expelled President Evo Morales after he rigged his own presidential elections. People took to the streets and attempted to storm the palace. Morales asked the army to intervene, but the army refused, and Morales had to flee to Mexico, a country that incidentally also has a socialist president. We hope and pray that our own Venezuelan armed forces follow their example, and fight for the Venezuelan people. And with that, I thank you for having me here, and I will attempt some answers. You have a question?
You didn't mention the drug situation with the military.
I only had a few minutes. That's a very good question. The question was, if I may, the question was, I did not mention the drug situation with the military, and I just don't have enough time to go over things, but I'll go through it. One of the first things that Nicolás Maduro did was to try to buy the military. So immediately he purged all the officers that he knew weren't going to be supportive, and then he gave them not just drugs but several other ways of making money. During the time that Maduro came in, the FARC guerrilla was defeated in Colombia. So the drug dealers needed a different way to get drugs into the United States. And which better way than the Venezuelan government? So Maduro allowed his Guardia Nacional, one cartel is the Guardia Nacional and the other one was the army, to traffic drugs from Colombia to Venezuela through Nicaragua and Mexico. The DEA has, I'm guessing, 20 high-ranking Venezuelan officials in their list, in their eyes, as most wanted people. And the nephews of Maduro are in jail in Miami as for drug trafficking. So it is an incredible problem. But that's one of the ways that socialists will that in this particular case, the army is funding itself.
That's why that failed the president of the assembly, because he couldn't get the military to move.
That's right. And that's smart. The Soviets did it with Trotsky, and the first thing you want to do is you want to control the people that have the guns. Evo Morales didn't do it in Colombia, so he was kicked out. But you were right, sir.
One of the things that my husband and I both traveled a lot in business and went to Caracas, Venezuela, beautiful city. And one thing that we noticed then, it wasn't really that safe at its peak in the 90s. And our company would send people to meet us at the airport, and we'd never go into a private taxi. There'd always be a service to take us everywhere because it was not safe. And I could never forget the first time I came through the tunnel and you look at the barrios.
Yeah.
On both sides of the highway.
Shanty towns.
And the other practice that they had there is all the people were, this is at its peak, A, B, C, D, and E, and the percentage of the population, these are socioeconomic categories, and most of the population fell in the lower income. And there didn't seem to be a lot of opportunity, even though it was mostly a market economy. So I think from the beginning of it at its peak, it was not really embracing capitalism in the full extent of that word. I might be mistaken, but that's the impression I had.
I tend to disagree with that impression. That it is what happens with Caracas is in a valley. There's huge mountains on the side, and the area of Caracas is very small. That's where all industry is. That's where all the government is, and everything else. So there really is no land to develop housing. So what the poorer people have done is they've been squatting on land on the hillsides. It looks pretty bad, but it is not as bad as Mexico City, or you find the same thing in Lima, find the same thing in Bogota. As I mentioned before, there was full employment. We couldn't find enough people to work. We had to go to Colombia. Colombians love to come to Venezuela because they got paid. The economy was a lot better.
Just to give you a little bit of my family visited Maracaibo for a wedding in 2004.
Was it hot?
It was hot. Thank God for the polar beer.
Polar beer, yeah.
They had some great inventions down there. You could get a pitcher of beer, and to keep it cold, they had an ice cold cylinder in the middle that kept it nice and cold. So the beer was great. But the thing that really struck me, this was in 2004.
Yep.
We were rapidly trying to exchange as many American dollars for bolivares. And now, to think of millions of inflation today, but when we got there, there was about 40 of us that went there, and we bought all our tickets, our hotels, everything, and they were able to, two professors from University of Maracaibo, which very well-educated people, and I don't know about Caracas. We flew through Caracas too on our way to Los Rocos Islands.
Los Roques, you went to Los Roques?
Oh my God,
nice.
beautiful, paradise. And again, good beer out there too. But it just struck me. My nephew married a young girl from Maracaibo, and she was so well. They send their kids here to America also to go to the University of Dallas and whatnot. Very well educated people, and to just see from 2004 to today, All of her family's now over here. The professors, their pensions are gone. Their properties have been seized. And it's just amazing how socialism in just a decade has just absolutely devastated and ruined an entire country with 30 million people, which compared to some of these other bigger countries like Mexico, with much bigger populations and hardly a fraction of the oil reserves, and they can't figure this out.
Well, Mexico's
You know?
Mexico's going the same way.
Yeah, but I just love Venezuela, and I feel so badly for people like you that have lost, your families that have lost what they've lost. But we're very happy to have you here in America.
So your nephew married a Maracucha, they call them that way. And Maracaibo people have an incredible sense of humor. The problem with Maracaibo and the rest of the country is that the government has been keeping all the resources like electricity, water, and maintenance in keeping Caracas happy, believe it or not, because they know that insurrection can only happen in Caracas. It cannot happen in Maracaibo because the palace is in Caracas. So the rest of the country, including Maracaibo, have been left totally devoid of resources. So there's no electricity, there's no water. While in Caracas you may get water 8 hours a day or electricity 8 hours a day, in Maracaibo you just don't get it at all. And that's what's caused people from the countryside to have to emigrate.
Yeah, the other thing we saw was in Maracaibo, you didn't have this military presence. When we flew from Maracaibo back through Caracas to go to Los Rocos, there was military everywhere with the machine guns.
There are several states in Venezuela that are right-wing. And by right-wing, I mean somebody that would qualify as socialist here. But I mean, they're free enterprise, and that's the Andes region. And Maracaibo is the Zulia, very hardworking people, and they're very much in opposition to Chavez. So they have their own police.
The other thing that you notice is don't give up your guns, because not many Venezuelans own their own rifles and handguns anymore.
I was on that trip with him, and he forgot to tell you we were about 10 feet away from Hugo Chavez.
Really?
As he came through with his military men, and we were in our hotel. It was a very scary situation in 2004.
I hope you wash thoroughly.
Thank you, Jose. Again, it's always great to get those firsthand accounts of exactly what's happening across the world, because so many times until you see it with your own eyes or hear it from someone that sees it with their own eyes, you really don't truly understand what's happening on the ground.